We're here at the last talk of the day on the second stage at the Proof of Work Summit, introducing my colleague Ben Waal, who's going to be talking about action happening at the edges.
Thank you very much. All right. Okay, I'd like to start off by kind of pointing something out. I'm not young anymore. I used to be young, and then I kind of ended up not being young, and I'm not quite sure how that happened. But it's one of these things that just kind of happens over time. You become not young, and it's a little bit annoying, actually. But one of the things about not being young is that I've seen a lot of stuff change. I've seen the world change around me. I've seen people make stuff change, and I've seen stuff changing without people really thinking about how and why and just kind of letting things happen around them. And I've been thinking a lot about change. And one of the weird and interesting things with change is that change requires action. You can look at it even from the most fundamental physics perspective, if you want, and say that anything requires some kind of energy input in order to actually happen. If there's zero energy, zero heat, then nothing happens. Eventually the universe may end up in a heat death, and then nothing happens anymore. So for stuff to happen, you need action. You then have the question, well, okay, what is action and where does action happen? As per the title of this talk, action happens at the edges. So what does that really mean? Probably the first thing to really think about is that change never happens directly from the middle of a system, the very deep inside of a system. Change always seems to happen from external pressures, from stuff happening from outside the system, or maybe from the very edges of that system itself. And that's really what I'm talking about here with action that happens at the edges. So change can be good, change can be bad, change can be neutral. Change is just things happening, which are different. And often change is undirected. Undirected change tends to be very short-term goal-oriented, as in you think about the need for I'm hungry, I want to eat something, then I won't be hungry anymore. It's a change. It's a positive change, probably. But you're not really thinking about the long-term effects of it. You may, however, say, I want to lose weight. I want to become healthier. So I'm going to think about what I eat, and I'm going to think about when I eat and exactly what kinds of stuff. So that's a more long-term directed change. So you've got undirected change and you've got directed change. All of this is going to get to a point about Bitcoin, but I'm going to take the long way there because I think that's more fun. So instead of talking about Bitcoin, first I'm going to talk about biology. So there's this really cool experiment that you can set up, and you could set this up at home, but I actually advise against it just because you can accidentally do something pretty dangerous. Take some bacteria, something that generally speaking can be killed by penicillin. Put it at one edge of a petri dish. And then a little bit further over, put some penicillin, just a little bit. A little bit further over from that, put a heavier concentration of penicillin. A little bit further over from that, an even heavier concentration. And then let it grow. Let the bacteria grow in this culture. What you'll see is the bacteria will grow up to the penicillin and then stop. Then some time will pass, and you'll see the bacteria grow a little bit further over that first layer of penicillin. And they'll stop at the next one. A little bit later, it'll grow again over the next layer, and so on and so on. What you are actually doing there is breeding a superbug, essentially in the exact same way that happens with MRSA in hospitals, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. The penicillin is killing most of the bacteria. So the bacteria reach it and they die. But every so often, there's a mutation in the bacteria, and that allows some of them to survive a small amount of penicillin. So you now have penicillin-resistant, or slightly penicillin-resistant bacteria who can grow over that next layer. They hit the higher concentration, and you have to do the same thing again. If you took some of the heavy concentration of penicillin and dropped it on the other end, all of those would die. It would just kill them. But at the edge, where the bacteria reached that layer of penicillin, change happened. Evolution happened. You also see that with macroevolution. So without going into too much on different things, the peppered moth is a really cool example. Peppered moths come in two colors, white and black. White peppered moths are kind of mostly white with a few black speckles. Black peppered moths are mostly black with a few white speckles. And birds eat them, so they've got natural predators, that kind of thing. During the Industrial Revolution, around cities, the white peppered moth disappeared because all of the buildings, all of the trees, everything got darker from the smoke from the Industrial Revolution. And the white peppered moths got eaten. The black peppered moths did not get eaten. So, change happens when there is an external pressure coming in or when you hit a barrier of some kind. That's action happening at the edges. It happens with more than biology, of course. So, language is a really cool one. By the way, all these pictures are AI generated, so excuse this guy not having a face. That's just what happens when you ask DALL-E to generate images for a PowerPoint slide. So the same thing happens with language. I think everyone's generally aware that Spanish, Italian, Romanian, French are they're Romance languages. They're in the Romance language family. They all evolved from Latin. At no point did a Latin mother give birth to a Spanish-speaking baby. That's ridiculous. That never happened. You generally think that your kids speak the same language that you do, but actually they don't. Your kids don't speak the same language that you do. How many of you are familiar with Gen Alpha kids? Phrases like skibbity toilet and Ohio Riz. Do you know what those things mean? I don't. But those are terms that Gen Alpha kids use. They're part of the language that's being used by young people. Over time, language drifts and it changes. And what once was Latin is now French and Spanish and Italian and Romanian and Romansh and a few others. So, how did it change? Well, it's two main ways. One is exactly that example I gave, young people. The edge of our age range in humans is where that language change happens. The young people have their own language. Us older people, we grow, we eventually die, and now those younger people have their new modified form of the language, and then they become the old people, and their younger ones have a new modified form of the language. So language changes over time. It also changes at the edges of physical contact. So in the age of exploration, you would get on a boat and you would travel halfway around the world and maybe trade spices with some people, and you'd have to be able to talk to them. So you would speak to them, they would speak back to you, you'd kind of figure out some kind of linguistic compromise, and words would drift in and out of those languages. So the languages are changing by contact. So at the edge of our age range and at the edge of our physical space, action is happening in linguistics. Action also happens in companies. Business innovation is a form of action happening at the edges. There's a couple of good examples of that, but if you think of the idea of skunk works, so that idea first came from Lockheed Martin, their, what was it called? Their Advanced Development Programs system. It was a secret back kind of thing that Lockheed Martin did to develop interesting, new, cool stuff outside of their main corporate structure. Lots of companies do that now, and we use the word skunk works for it fairly openly and generically, but I've worked in some very big corporates. I also worked in some very small startups, sort of everything in between. And in big corporates, you will often have an innovation department who doesn't have to follow the same rules as everyone else. They don't have to have the same kind of reporting into the central management. You get given some kind of budget, and you get to play with it. You get to experiment. You get to do things that other people inside the company in the other departments wouldn't be allowed to do, because that's how change happens. Action happens at the edges, not in this central core of the company. A nice little anecdote for a story like that is actually McDonald's. Who here likes eating at McDonald's? Okay, a couple of people. I was expecting kind of zero because it's not popular to say you like eating at McDonald's, but it's a thing. The filet-o-fish was not supposed to exist. There was a time McDonald's pretty much only sold the beef hamburgers, back early 1950s kind of thing. And all right, yep. And the management said not a lot of people are buying our burgers on Fridays and during times like Lent. So there are religious reasons that people choose to not eat the beef hamburgers. Can we offer them something else? And central management came up with the idea of the hula burger, which is basically a Big Mac where you replace the beef patties with slices of pineapple. It did not go over well. Nobody was really that interested in it. It didn't sell particularly well. But one guy in one small franchise said, I'm going to make a fish burger instead. There were some competition reasons for it and so on. Central management hated the idea, so they ran a competition. Everyone will sell hula burgers and this new fish burger side by side and see which one wins out, and of course the fish one won out. So worldwide, McDonald's now has Filet-O-Fish because one franchisee said, I'm going to do this instead of that silly pineapple thing. So again, it's action happening at the edges, not from the centralized system. It's also true for political action, of course. I think most people are generally aware that in politics, you can influence a lot by pushing, by talking and saying, I want this to happen. You organize action groups, you organize activism. It can even be relatively outside of the system kind of activism. If you think groups like Just Stop Oil are failing to do anything, then you're not actually paying attention to how much politicians are doing things because of the actions of these activists. So, in politics, you can influence things from the outside. Centralized politics doesn't like this in general, so they have a couple of ways to fight against it. But I would say the fact that they fight against it even shows that they know this is how action happens, this is how change happens at the edges. If you look at, for example, the rise of populism in general, populism involves getting people to like you for who you are rather than like you for the things that you're going to do. So it engages people's emotion rather than people's intelligence. Populism allows for people to kind of push down the edges by getting the masses to have a particular feeling, a particular idea, and then the centralized force can try to express that without letting those pesky edges get in the way. Authoritarian governments often do it another way. They will have a very well-paid, well-enforced military who have really good lives. And those militaries don't want to lose their really good lives. So you can use the military to oppress the people. So get rid of the edges. But you see what they're doing? They're getting rid of the edges because they know that action happens at the edges and they don't want to see change. Kids. That's a freakish AI image. I probably could have chosen a better one. That kid is disturbing.
I don't know, it looks to me the way that I look in school.
Possibly, yeah. I pretty much just tried to generate bored kids in school. But, okay. How many kids out there can name 100 different Pokemon? Okay, my daughter is raising her hand. Excellent. How many kids out there can remember 10 things that the physics teacher said in physics class? Most of them not. Why? Yeah, they're not interested in what's going on in school, so they phase it out, they tune it out. But that's largely because there's this centralized push to say this is what you must learn, and the kids naturally resist that because humans naturally resist that. But you will easily go and learn 100 Pokemon name because it's cool and it's interesting and you're doing it on your own. If you go and learn something on your own, you remember it, it sticks, it stays. Somebody tries to force information into your head, maybe some of it will stay. Actually, there's this old idea that when you stand in front of a group of people talking about something, they will hear 10% of what you say, they will remember 10% of what they heard, and they'll be able to repeat 10% of what they remember. So it tends to be pretty low.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
No. Okay. It's also true with cultural evolution, cultural change. So, we've got artistic movements, things like music. Once upon a time, jazz was considered this countercultural kind of thing. You wouldn't talk about jazz music in polite company, and then later punk music, and then later hip-hop music. These were all the edges of society. They were this countercultural idea, and now those things become mainstream. And the things that are on the edges today will become the mainstream, because they are changing the way that we view the world. Once upon a time, graffiti was just this dark underground thing, people going and painting on walls, and now you have, professional graffiti artists. You have people being paid lots of money to go and draw murals on walls in a graffiti style, and I think that's great. But it's a different approach than what you really expect, because you expect people to say, oh no, this thing is bad, so we push it out. That's actually not what happens. People say this thing is bad until that thing comes in and takes over. You even see it in other parts of cultural revolutions, like the rights of LGBTQ people. So, no matter what your personal opinions may be, it is true that once upon a time, if a man came out and said, I'm in love with another man, that's nearly a death sentence for him, and it still is in some parts of the world. But societally, that was never acceptable. Now, you're just like, okay, yeah, that's a thing that happens. That's normal, nothing different. So, as people gain rights, we can see, there's a lot more acceptance of different ways of thinking, different ways of being. And that's, again, this edges of society pushing in. One last thing before we get onto Bitcoin, I promise, is, of course, science. So, in science, you look at things like quantum physics. Quantum physics came out of people studying the boundaries of classical mechanics. So, when we're studying classical physics, some things don't work. Why don't they work? And you have to come up with these other explanations, and quantum physics kind of fits in there. So there's still actually a big gap in physics where we can't quite get quantum to work well with classical mechanics. But those edges are where we started getting new ground and new understanding. The same in biological sciences. So CRISPR, gene editing, came out of trying to improve other biological systems, and we saw how particular viral agents act on living tissues, and we said, hold on, we can replicate that and we can use that for gene editing purposes. So scientific breakthroughs are also coming from the edges rather than from the centralized groups. If you look at centralized pharmaceutical studies, for example, that's all about taking the existing stuff and using it as much as possible. The actual research is on the edges. So finally, that brings us on to proof of work. Specifically, I talk about Bitcoin most of the time, but you can imagine this in relation to anything, really. Bitcoin was established on the edges of finance. Bitcoin is this almost countercultural thing right on the edge. But the edge, in a lot of ways, is fractal. The edge of finance may be Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is bringing in all of these interesting things into the world of finance. But Bitcoin itself has a center, has a core, has a establishment, and then there's the edges around that. If you look at social media, I advise against it, but unfortunately Twitter keeps calling me back in, and you will see on Bitcoin Twitter, everybody's talking about how much money can I make, and they're pushing for certain politicians because they believe it's going to increase the value of their Bitcoin, and that's a good thing for them. But the people who are actually making changes to Bitcoin, the people who are actually doing stuff that changes how Bitcoin works, how things actually behave, are not those people. Those people are doing nothing for Bitcoin, nothing to Bitcoin. Those people are doing things to themselves. Trying to make themselves rich. Okay, fine, if they want to be rich, that's their prerogative. I don't care. I don't have that much of an interest in being rich. I have an interest in changing the world. I have an interest in making the world a better place. And that's where you see all of these other technologies that are especially being talked about in conferences like this. People coming along and saying, well, okay, what are all of these different scaling technologies? How about we use this technology in combination with that technology and bring them together and actually do something interesting? And all of these things are what actually changes Bitcoin and makes Bitcoin different and better, usually, in some cases, maybe worse in other cases. Like I said, not all change, not all action is positive. But it is at least change, and it's something you can try. So here's a little imaginary story. So we can, if there's any anthropologists listening to this now or later, I apologize. Let's go back to the caveman times, and there's two cavemen sitting there, Ugg and Bug. And Ugg says, I think we should eat rocks. And Bug says, there was a forest fire, and my pig meat tasted better after that forest fire. So I'm going to hold my pig meat over the fire from now on before I eat it. Ugg died with no descendants because eating rocks is pretty stupid. Bug did not die, and now we all cook our food. Like I said, I apologize to any anthropologists listening because that was a ridiculous story, but the same kind of thing will or can, does, and will happen with changes to Bitcoin. When we look at all of these different scaling technologies, some of them will work, some of them won't. When we look at all of these other ideas, whether it be ordinals, NFTs, some kind of new idea. Actually, I think proof of stake is a perfect example because it's stupid and doesn't work very well as an idea, my personal opinion here. But I think it will die on its own because it's the bad idea. It's the eating rocks. Whereas some other ideas will be the cooking food. And right now, maybe even for some of these ideas, we don't know which one is which. Maybe this idea that somebody's talking about is the eating rocks idea. Maybe it's the cooking food idea. But at least it's a change, and we can try it, and we can try a bunch of different things, and some of them will work, and some of them won't. But we need to be actually doing things. We need to be having action. So that's pretty much it. No matter what you do, what I'm encouraging is do something. Do some action at the edges, because that is what is going to change the entire system that you're trying to change. Thank you very much.
What do you think of the key cypherpunk principles, that we espouse over and over again? Which one of them do you think led the most to, or enables most change to happen at the edges?
That's a very good question. I would say probably the most important principle is critical thinking, in that you do not just dismiss things because you don't like the sound of them. You have to be willing to throw your own ideas and other people's ideas up against a wall and see what sticks, and trying things, essentially a form of open-mindedness. And I would say it's even not just a cypherpunk principle, it's a general anarchist principle of being willing to try different things and being willing to see what works and what doesn't, and the humility that goes along with it. So actually being willing to say, I was wrong, being willing to say, I don't know to a lot of things. People always seem to get stuck on that one. They're like, oh, I don't want to say I don't know because it makes me look stupid. No, I don't know is a much better answer than the wrong answer. And I think those kinds of principles are the principles that enable good change.
So I think curiosity, so intellectual curiosity, the willingness to experiment, right? The willingness to be wrong. I think those are all really, really super key principles. And the older I get, the more I've learned from experience how important that is. Because man, I've been wrong so many times. Yeah.
Same.
I would actually advocate that it's the permissionlessness of the open source ethos that is what turbocharged, the experimentation that we're seeing.
I think that's a good argument. However, I would actually maybe frame it slightly differently in that I view, maybe it's just because I've been an anarchist my entire life, I view the world already as being permissionless. Permission is something that gets laid in over top, and you are free to ignore it.
Okay. So are you open for the possibility that Bitcoin is not our end station?
Yes, I think it's very unlikely from what I've seen, which is why I consider myself a Bitcoiner. I think from what I've seen, all of the information that I have, I think Bitcoin is the thing that is going to succeed. I think it's going to bring a lot of interesting things out from outside. So from a lot of these other non-Bitcoin projects, I think there's going to be a lot of technology that is going to be utilized in some way, and it's going to be very interesting to see what works and what doesn't. But I'm also willing to say, yes, I could be wrong on that, and maybe something will come along that's going to be way better than Bitcoin and will completely supplant it. I'm not against the idea.
Right. So let's talk about actually this key point when we're talking about proof of work.
Yep.
Right? Is it literally the Bitcoin implementation of proof of work that you think is the key winner, or do you think it's the proof of work algorithm
I think
is the key winner?
I think it's the proof of work algorithm that's the key winner, because proof of work itself is what makes Bitcoin what it is in reality. Proof of work with the difficulty adjustment, which is what we generally mean when we talk about proof of work, is the key innovation that Bitcoin created and what it really is. When people say, oh, the blockchain is the innovation, I disagree. That's the data store behind it. The proof of work with difficulty adjustment is the thing that made it unique and special. And now there's other things doing something similar and with tweaks and differences. I do think proof of work is the interesting thing. I also actually think proof of work, like a lot of things, will form some kind of natural monopoly. So I think it is actually the case that eventually one proof of work chain will actually have to win out against the others. When I say eventually, I do mean it even could be hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. So I'm not saying even short term at all, but I do think it's a natural thing that will happen, that one proof of work chain would have to kind of eat the others, just purely on a game theoretic standpoint. That said, though, right now I believe that will be Bitcoin, but I can't say that for certain. I don't ever like to prognosticate about the future.
So I'd like to challenge you once more with a final question, and then
Sure.
we should all run upstairs for the proof of scale panel. If constant is the only change,
Yeah.
and if change happens at the edges,
Yep.
yeah, what do you see on our immediate horizon for Bitcoin and
Yeah.
proof of work?
So I see a lot more things happening with some of the layer 2s. I think those are really where the big edges are at the moment. I'm really interested, for example, in things like multi-party lightning, which there was a paper written about it 2 years ago, and it hasn't gained much traction yet. But I think that's a really interesting idea, where you have a single multi-person smart contract rather than just being a 2 of 2 multi-sig, and that's a single channel involving multiple people.
And that's the argument that's being made right now for BitVM and OpCat,
Yep.
right, as the multi-party
Exactly.
signatories, right?
Exactly.
And yet we already have that as a theoretical framework on Lightning.
Yeah, so I think there are, and I also think some of these things can work well together. So I can imagine, for example, Arc being used to instantiate Lightning channels. Like, there's actually no reason you couldn't do that. So I think some of these things can play together very well on the technical side and see what works and what doesn't. But again, I don't want to say which ones are the eating rocks ideas and which ones are the cooking your food idea. That will come out with time.
Okay, one last final question.
Sure.
Do you think your daughter knows better than you do what Bitcoin's going to be like in 20 years?
I don't think she does know, but I think she'll be one of the people shaping it far more than I am, giving a few more years. Yeah.
Amazing. Ben.
Always a pleasure.
So we've got one final talk. If you want to switch over to the live stream on stage 1 is the Layer 2 panel, which is being moderated by Janusz, and we have all of our L2 people up there at the main stage. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to run upstairs.